Today we are going to be taking a quick look at the Traska Commuter in 34 millimeters. This specific version of the watch was sent to me by the brand because I ordered the 36 myself, but was curious to see them both side by side. So we're going to just talk a little bit about the differences in this model and kind of do a little brief overview. So hope you enjoy. So we have a diameter of 34.5, lug to lug of 41.5, height of 10.7, and a lug width of 19 millimeters. The specifications between this and the other versions of the watch pretty much remain the same. It has that same Miyota 93.9 beating away in here through a closed case back. We do have BGW9 loom. We do have 100 meters of water resistance with a screw down crown. We of course still have the same box sapphire crystal with under AR coating on it, and the only difference is, again, each of the variations of size on Traska's website retail for a different price point within a couple of like $20 to $30 of each other. This one retails for $580, which is the cheapest of the bunch. And specifically, this only comes in a no date variant. I'm going to try to move through this review fairly quickly, mainly because this has, for all intents and purposes, the exact same form factor and build and aesthetic as the 36 millimeter version I already reviewed. Maybe I'll drop them together. Maybe that would make sense. I don't know. We'll see. But there are just a couple differences. Now, none of those differences really exist on the dial. One thing you may notice, though, is when I kind of held them up side by side, unfortunately, I don't have the 36 anymore, but you can see it in the other video. These two dials do feel very different in person, mainly because the 36 millimeter variant has more negative space to it. So it does feel larger than 36 for that variant, and this one by comparison actually feels smaller than 34, which is an interesting kind of difference between the two. We do have the second track along the outboard, taking away some of that space from the inner dial. Of course, the rectangular hour markers. We do have just simple text here, 2 lines at the top, Traska and the logo, 1 line at the bottom just saying automatic. Classic baton hands with that little bit of brushing in the middle to help just visually stand out against the dial itself. It overall is a good looking dial. We of course have this classic mint that Traska continues to use throughout their range, and I think is very unique in terms of all watches. It's just a nice new color. It's not quite green, it's not quite blue, it's somewhere in between. It's much more fun. So zooming in on the dial, we of course still have this kind of speckled paint base dial texture, which gives it this little interesting look up close. It's not something you really notice from wrist view. It looks like a plain flat colored dial, but I'm sure this helps with the matteness of the dial overall. To note, this is I believe a prototype that was sent for me to review. This is not something that's going to be sold, so there might be a few little issues here and there, like we can see a speck on the dial, a little bit of scratching on the hands that weren't as present on the model that I reviewed previously. Printing is done very well. I would like to see it a little bit inkier on the text again. The markers, I think, are beautifully done with their multifaceted nature, the 2 kind of sloping sides and the one just a flat rounded top. It looks good. I think it just shines nicely, catches the light nicely. Again, there is roughness to the markers themselves. I believe we found that with the 36 as well. So this is something they could try to up the kind of build quality on. But even as it is, I do think it appears very nicely. And for the price point, you really can't complain too much. At the end of the day, what matters most is if it looks good when you're wearing it, if there's nothing too glaringly obvious to where it really stands out on the wrist, and this watch does that. Even with the more present QCs we see here versus the 36 version, it still is a nice looking dial. It still is relatively well done. And just keep in mind, again, this is a more prototype version. And something you can kind of notice at this angle, the loom between the hands and the indices sometimes mismatch with the hand loom leaning a little bit more greenish. Just a very slight tinge of that. I don't really know why that is, but as it stands, it doesn't really happen in direct sunlight, but you do see it every now and then. Moving on to the case of this watch, I did forget to mention, of course, this variation also has that proprietary coating from Traska that makes it more scratch resistant and pretty much leads to no scratches happening at all. I bring in a nice little strap changing tool and really try to scratch the bracelet. Again, I was not being gentle, and there is not a mark at all. So this is something which over time you will see holds up very well. It is one of those watches that will probably look pretty new for a very long time and probably never show much wear to it at all. Moving on and looking more generally, the main differences between this and the 36 version is one, of course, the proportionality of it. The dial, because there's such little negative space, ends up feeling a lot smaller, but it also is the fact that they did do the case finishing differently. I did mention this in the previous 36 video, but the chamfer here along the side of the case is much more pronounced. It makes it feel more premium, and it also just makes this watch feel a little bit more dressy by comparison to that 36mm version. It is, I still think, a good looking case, and arguably to me I actually like the finishing of this case more than the 36mm version. It feels less utilitarian. And it is unfortunate you only see it in this 34mm version. Of course, high polish on the sides of the case, drilled lug holes, vertical brushing on the top of the case, more of a sunburst brushing on the bezel. It is a nicely finished watch. The brushing is done very well. It doesn't look cheaply machined. The clasp is done nicely with multiple holes and micro adjust, which is very good there. Of course, if you go with one of the newer versions of the watch, it does have that on the fly micro adjust, which is even better. So there really is no complaint I can give about the watch. It feels solid, it feels well built, it looks nice, it looks premium. I will just say, and we'll see this in a second, the 34 does wear very small. I would say if you're used to like 32 or 33mm wearing watches, this will kind of be at home, because when you go for 34s, especially vintage ones, they tend to be more all dial, and they end up wearing larger feeling or have a visually larger stance on wrist, where this is pretty much the opposite. So by comparison, earlier I was wearing this 34mm Tudor, and if I just slot in this 34mm Traska right next to it, at least to my eye, the Tudor seems larger, it seems bigger. Again, the Tudor feels a lot larger to me, which is strange because technically the Tudor is slightly smaller. It's a 34.2mm case versus 34.5 on the Traska. What is interesting is you can kind of tell the bezel is a little larger on the Traska. So the actual dial diameter and kind of like the crystal to crystal measurement of the Tudor is 29mm, whereas on the Traska it's 28. So you can kind of see there we start seeing a little bit of a smaller dimension on the Traska. And then from there you can kind of tell the Tudor has all the markers on the very edge of the crystal or very edge of the dial, which frees up some space in the middle. Whereas with here on the Traska, we have the seconds track on the very outer edge, and then the relatively large and non-tapering index moved more towards the middle of the dial. So it is just creating less and less negative space here on the Traska. It makes it feel smaller and smaller and more condensed, and you definitely do get that feel on the wrist. So if you're into small watches, this will feel nice and good for you. If you have a more small wrist, like kind of 5.5, 5 inches, or even smaller than that, this will probably feel great. But for those with 6.5 and up, you really just have to be really, really into that vintage and small aesthetic to like this kind of style and size. So here we have the 34 sitting on my 6.5 inch wrist. And I think you can tell it looks fairly small. It doesn't look too undersized, but I know some people will think, oh my God, you're wearing a girl's watch. That's fine. But even for me personally, I do like smaller watches. I have that 34mm Tudor. I have some other vintage sized watches. This is bordering on too small for my taste. It's not bad, it's just the proportions of it, again, make it feel and wear small. Does it feel solid? Does it feel great? Yes. Does it wear smaller than 34mm Rolexes I've tried on? Yes. So it's just one of those things where the dimensions are a little bit different here, and I think it's very noticeable on wrist. I do just love the chamfer though. It's just that contrast when the brushing lights up, when you get it at the right angle, then the polish really shines out. This is the way all the chamfering should be done on all Traska cases because it makes it feel so much more premium. Well, the 36mm version, we just have a tiny little sliver. And while that's nice, it just kind of feels like an afterthought. It feels like, I think we should have a chamfering, so let's put some there. This feels like a design choice. This feels like it adds to the overall package. What I do like too is this, although small and kind of stout in a dimension, it's not overly thick. It still wears well on the wrist. It doesn't feel bulbous in any way. It just feels like a nice wearing watch. So people who like this size and like this proportionality, I think will really like this on wrist. Move the watch up a little bit. That's actually closer to where I actually have a 6.5 inch wrist. You can see a lot of space on both sides. Tons of clearance. It is a very small looking watch. If I move it here closer to a 6 inch wrist there, again, still small. So you can wear this on very, very small wrists and it would still look pretty good. Again, that's around 6 inches right there. Can definitely probably even go down to 4.5 and it will still look very proportional. And then just a real quick size comparison so we can get an idea of the two together. That is the 36 and that is the 34. Not bad by any means, but again, just a very much smaller watch overall, and almost more dressy because of that. It is not necessarily a sports watch for being this small, but then again, if you have a smaller wrist, this will be a fine watch for you. And then moving on to some other straps here, one thing I do like is that they kept that 19mm lug width, or they went to a 19mm lug width rather than going to 18 or 17, which would have been a little awkward. It gives the watch a nice stance and doesn't make it feel too dainty or dressy rather than sporty, which is supposed to be. Good stance again from that strap. This one even tapers down to 16mm, so it has a little bit of an elegance to it. But even then, I think the watch wears it well. It takes it nicely. This strap, I think, adds a really nice sleekness to the watch. This is a black Saffiano leather from Veblenist. Really good pairing, I think, in my opinion. Of course, ties into some of the black tones that are already on the watch, helps contrast it very nicely. And super thin too, so it's pretty just nice on the wrist. Just, I think, blends nicely. It's not too dressy, it's not too casual either, and it's not really as crazy as an exotic grained alligator or anything like that. So I think this is a pretty killer option if you want to take it off the bracelet and kind of dress it up or down. So the pros for this watch really remain the same as the previous version. It's fantastic build quality. I think it's great value for just around $600. The brand is giving you a lot of kind of ticked boxes of what every watch nerd wants. They want sapphire crystal, they want 100 meters of water resistance, they want something that's relatively thin and has micro adjust and this and this and that, and this does a lot of that, and I think it does it well. The build quality is still fantastic. The watch, I think, arguably aesthetically still looks awesome, and it even improves slightly on the bigger brothers to this model, being that this chamfer actually looks amazing here and makes the watch much more elegant. But there are still cons to this model, and they are different than the 36mm version. And the biggest con for me is that the dial feels too crowded. They've gone for a small dial here because, well, it is a small watch, but the proportions, I think, are still a little bit off. You have the markers that are very long. They feel like they're cutting into the dial at least too much to me, and it just feels very crowded. It doesn't feel like a large watch for 34, which is kind of weird to say, but in my experience, it wears smaller than other 34s I've tried on, and I think that can be improved. But realistically, other than the fact that this feels a little bit smaller than even 34mm would suggest, this is a pretty awesome watch. Of course, it probably still has the same issue with micro adjust that the other versions have. I didn't have the micro adjust on this model, so I can't speak to it, but I could just assume it's the same throughout the line. But again, that is a small issue, and I think something that can be dealt with overall, or can be lived with rather. So taking all that into account, if this size appeals to you, I think this is a fantastic watch and probably one of the best values in the Traska lineup. It's an amazing build quality. It doesn't feel overly thick for what you're getting as well. You still have a lot of water resistance. It still has an automatic movement, but it doesn't feel pudgy. It still feels pretty slim and comfortable on the wrist. It's a killer watch, and it's nice too because I know some people have smaller wrists out there. Some people maybe want watches in this size, but there's pretty much no companies making them. This is a fantastic option, I think, either for the lady in your life who really wants a smaller watch, or just for the small wristed dudes out there who want something a little more elegant and classic, or even still, if you just want to get your girlfriend or wife a watch, but they're not super into watches and you don't want to spend super tons of money on something that they'll never wear and that's too expensive, this is a great starter watch, especially because it has that extra scratch resistant coating and it will not scratch pretty much to anything. I think great value, great watch. There's really not that many cons to it, and I think a lot of people will enjoy this watch, especially if they like this size. But anyway, those are just my thoughts and really ramblings for the most part. Thank you as always for watching the video. Hope you got something out of it, and I will see you in another one.